Well, good morning again, church family. Man, I'm so glad that you are here today. I hope that you're excited to be here today as well. We're excited about this sermon series that we're in, especially since this is Memorial Day weekend, and this being the fourth week of this series called Fight the Good Fight, right? The fight of your life. That's what we're talking about. One thing is for certain, and this is what we said from the very beginning about this series: you are in the fight of your life. You're in the fight of your life in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different areas in your life, whether we want to admit it, whether we want to acknowledge it. In fact, what I would even say is our enemy doesn't want us to acknowledge it, doesn't want us to admit it. The enemy wants us just to continue to go on with life as if nothing at all is happening, nothing out of the ordinary. You're not in a fight at all. Right? There's nothing out of the ordinary happening in your life. In fact, the enemy would rather just go ahead and fight in the darknesses and the shadows of our lives. He would rather work in the crevices of your life where you don't pay any attention or acknowledge him at all. In fact, we could say that for many of the battles that we face, they're already won or lost based way before even the fight begins, depending on how well you prepare yourself for the battle. And that's true in life, that's true in a lot of different areas. Speaking of battles fought, and of course this being Memorial Day weekend, if you were to make a list of some of the more famous battles throughout history, we would probably go all the way back, starting in antiquity, whenever you see the first early recorded battles of the Greeks, right? All the way back to the Thermopylae, right? That early battle way back probably 400 BC or better, right? You'd have to go back to the Peloponnesian Wars between the Greeks and the Spartans. You'd have to go back to the Punic Wars, right? That would be where our list would begin. If you fast forward a few hundred years, you go to Rome, right? And the rise and as well as the fall of Rome. All the different battles that they were in. You would have to go to the great Norman, conquest of England, right? And the Battle of Hastings, one of the more famous battles in history. You'd even go to the 100-Year Wars, right, between England and France, or maybe you might think of like the Ottoman Wars, which are also a very bloody battle between Vienna and Austria. Maybe you think more recent than that to Napoleon, right, and all of the battles that he fought, the Battle of Waterloo, for example. These are all famous battles that we would probably think of, even thinking back to the origins of our great country. And you think about some of the battles that we have been in. You go to the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Yorktown, the Battle of Bunker Hill. If you go back, or go up in time a little bit to the Civil War, some of the most bloodiest battles in American history were in the Civil War. You have the Battle of Bull Run, the Battle of Gettysburg. I'm hoping that my family and I, when we go on vacation this summer, we're going to get a chance to see Gettysburg. But you think of, Antietam, probably the bloodiest battle of all. I mean, there's so many different battles that you can think of. Even when you get to the Great War, you get to World War II, you think of all of those battles. Some of you may have family members that have fought in World War II. Battle of Normandy, the Battle of Midway, the Battle of Stalingrad, the Battle of the Bulge. Some of us are still battling the Battle of the Bulge, right? I think that would be me. I'm trying. I'm fighting, though. Not giving up. But there are a lot of famous battles, right? If you think back in history, throughout history, and all the battles that have been fought, all the men and women that have laid down their lives for others, all the casualties of war, all of the innocent people that have died along the way. One battle that should mean a lot to you, and even though the war has already been decided, because in this battle, in the spiritual realm, in the spiritual battle that I want to talk about, Jesus has already won. He's already been declared victorious over the evil one, over sin, over death. But the battle, you see, rages on. And I want you to understand that this morning. It rages on in our lives. And it's not just, when we talk about this battle, it's not just the fight of our lives when it comes to our souls, when it comes to our hearts. That's what we talked about in week 1 of this series. And that's a very real in a very serious battle. Some of you may be in that battle today. You may have come in this morning, and there's a battle going on for your soul and in your heart. And that's something you need to take serious. But the battle I want to talk about today is also one that's very real and very present. And it's the fight of our lives when it comes to our legacies, when it comes to our faith or lack thereof, when it comes to what we will pass on to those who come after us. And that's what I want to talk to you about this morning. What kind of legacy, you think about this, what kind of legacy are you leaving for those who follow after you? Have you thought about that lately? For those around you, for those that are watching you, for those that are taking note. And you may not even think, there's nobody around me taking note, but there are. You don't understand. There are always people watching. And what kind of legacy are you leaving for them, for your family, for your children? What kind of example or legacy are you leaving for your church family? What kind of example are you leaving for your coworkers, your neighbors? What will people say after you are gone? Now, I know that this can be a very sobering way to begin a message. I get that. Some of you are thinking, man, I came this morning for this kind of conversation. I mean, it's Memorial Day weekend. Come on, Will, give me a little pep talk here. And I hope that by the end of what we're talking about this morning, it will be more uplifting to you. But I get it. This is a very sobering way to start. Certainly when we start to think about our lives and think about ourselves. I did hear a funny story that I kind of want to begin and segue here. It happened a while back, and I saw it on the news, and so I remembered it. You may not have seen this. I'm not really sure. It wasn't like huge breaking news or anything like that, but as I was preparing this week and thinking about legacy, I thought about this, and so I went back and I got all the research and I got all the pictures, and it's a bizarre story of sorts, but you know how it is. Sometimes when you come across a really strange story, it kind of sticks with you, right? And so this kind of stuck with me, and I began to pay a little bit more attention. And it happened in the city of Toronto up in Canada. And a raccoon, of all things, died on one of the busy city streets in the city. And what's so strange about it is the whole story is documented by pictures. And so I brought them with me this morning. And by the way, how many of you, let me see, how many of you love raccoons? Any of you love raccoons? This is going to be kind of tragic for you, okay? All right, so just prepare yourselves. There's some tissues around perhaps you can grab. But others of you, who doesn't like raccoons? You're like, man, I don't. The reason I ask that is because it's kind of funny. One of our Timothys of our church, Garrett Johnston, Ken and Pat's grandson, he hates raccoons. I mean, he's terrified of them. We used to tease him all the time about raccoons, and I would send him emails, and we got him a stuffed raccoon one time when, it's a lot of fun. But whether you like raccoons or not, the story is very interesting. And here's how it goes. At 9 a.m., a man reported a dead raccoon on the sidewalk to the city. And so there's the first picture I want to show you. No real big deal, right? Happens quite a bit, right? And so the city responded that they would take care of it. They radioed in and they said, okay, we'll take care of it. So go to the next picture. It was just kind of hanging out there, right? Just kind of hanging out there for quite a while. Around noon, somebody decided that they would attach a sticky note to the raccoon, which is kind of interesting. And here's what it said. It said, "Rest, dear raccoon. Help is on the way from the city." Now, about 6 hours later, let me show you the next picture there. He was found with a flower and a card and a framed photo. I'm not making this stuff up. This really happened, okay? Someone even gave the raccoon his own personal hashtag Dead Raccoon Toronto. That was the hashtag, right? Around about 8 p.m., he was still there, and the flowers and the letters began just to pile on. You can see there, right? They just began to pile on in the fifth and sixth pictures there. One city council member offered, what we ought to do and to remember our dear friend? We ought to leave all the trash bins open. And so I kid you not, look, they actually did this in the city. They opened up all of the trash bins so that the raccoons could all eat, right, a dinner and have a meal. Passerbys decided that, we need to do even more. They began to do a a candlelight vigil, and you can see that there. A candlelight vigil around the raccoon. Even some of the passerbys decided that they were going to, go to the next picture, kneel down and pray for the dead raccoon. I mean, this, again, I'm not making this stuff up. And what was interesting, too, is that there was a box that actually came to the outside of where the raccoon was. I guess a homeless person had figured out a way to make a little bit of money. And so they put a box there, and they put on there, this is what it said: the proper authorities will only remove this little fellow when enough funds have been raised. It says, donate generously for our trash panda to have a proper burial. That's what it said. They figured out a way to make a little money here. Finally, around 11 p.m., Toronto's animal services showed up, and you can see them in this next picture here. They're showing up, and they go to remove the raccoon. And what's interesting is that even after they had removed him, go to the next picture, people still continue to show up and put down candles where the raccoon once lay. Someone even had the foresight to write, we just need to remember him. And this became a viral thing, okay? They came up with this: friend, neighbor, raccoon. That's what they came up with. Crazy, right? That's a crazy story. Well, here's my question. What about us? What about when you die? How are you going to be remembered? What's going to be the conversation that comes up when your name is mentioned? What will people say about you? When someone sees a picture of you, they see who you are, what will be mentioned, what will be associated to your name. I don't know if you've thought about this much. Maybe you have. Maybe you think about it all the time. But I want to challenge you this morning to actually consider these questions. In what ways will you be missed when you are no longer here? What will your legacy be? I want to tell you another story. And again, you probably didn't hear this story. It didn't make national news, but it was very interesting because eventually it did go viral. And it's not because the person was famous at all. In fact, he didn't become famous until after his obituary was written. And he became famous at that moment, and it went viral. I want to read to you the obituary that was prepared by his family. It's 4 paragraphs long, and so just kind of indulge me on this, and we'll get through it. But it was the children who all came together to write about their dad, and I wanted to just I want you to hear this because it's amazing, really, that someone actually wrote this about someone else. And some of it's not appropriate for church, so I kind of, made it G-rated for us, okay? But here's what it said. Leslie Ray Popeye Charping, born in Galveston, Texas, on November 20th, 1942, and passed away January 30th, 2017, which was, and this is what it said, 29 years longer than expected and much longer than he deserved. Leslie battled with cancer his later years and lost his battle, ultimately due to being the horses behind that he was known for. He leaves behind 2 relieved children, a son, Leslie Ray Charping, a daughter, Sheila Smith, along with 6 grandchildren, countless other victims, it says, including an ex-wife, relatives, friends, neighbors, doctors, nurses, and random strangers. At a young age, listen, it goes on, Leslie quickly became a model of bad parenting combined with mental illness and a complete commitment to drinking and drugs, womanizing, and being generally offensive to everyone. Leslie enlisted to serve in the Navy, but not so much because of bravery or patriotism, but more as a part of a plea deal to escape a sentencing due to criminal charges. While enlisted, Leslie was a Navy boxing champ and went on to sufficiently embarrass his family and country by spending the remainder of his service in the Balboa Mental Health Hospital receiving much-needed health care services. Leslie was also surprisingly intelligent. However, he lacked ambition and motivation to do anything other than being reckless and wasteful, squandering the family savings and fantasizing about getting rich schemes. Leslie's hobbies included being abusive to his family, expediting trips to heaven for beloved family pets, fishing. He was a skilled hunter. Leslie's life served no other purpose. He did not contribute to society or serve his community, and he possessed no redeeming qualities besides quick-witted sarcasm, which was amusing during his sober days. With Leslie's passing, and this is the last paragraph, he will be missed only for what he never did, which was being a loving husband, father, and good friend. No services will be held in his honor. There will be no prayers for eternal peace, no apologies for the family he tortured. Leslie's passing proves that evil does in fact die, and hopefully marks a time of healing and safety for all. Wow. Right? That's incredible. And perhaps a statement, I think, that sums everything up. It says in there, he will be missed only for what he never did. How would you like to be remembered like that? I don't know about you, but it does seem like at times, we can kind of sum up life with a sentence, right? Maybe you can for your life, or maybe you can for your parent. I don't know. But it says that he will be missed only for what he never did. Well, I want to use that example to actually kind of segue into a Bible discussion here to talk about another guy that many of you may have never heard of before. You may have never read about. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me if you never had. And even though this man was an important person in the Bible, after all, he was a king. He was known as a king of Judah. I want to tell you about him because there is a line in the Bible that describes him that I believe is one of probably the saddest sentences that you can read in the Bible. And I want to show you that sentence here in just a second. But let me kind of explain a little bit of why this is so important and why the reason we're kind of building this up. Because here's kind of my prayer for all of us this morning. I pray that this is never said of you. I pray that it's never said of me. I pray that no one ever thinks this when we're gone. Sometimes we say things that we don't really mean. And some of the things we say, it can never be unsaid. It won't go away. And to understand the sentence, here's a little bit of the family history. This guy, as a king of Judah, he inherited his kingship from his father, who was also the king of Judah, who also inherited it from his father, who was also a king of Judah. So there are 3 generations here. And that's what I want you to see. Now, the grandfather's name was Jehoshaphat. And maybe you've heard of Jehoshaphat before, because he was a very famous king. Jehoshaphat had quite of a legacy. He was a very, very good man. He was a very, very good king. In fact, he was known as a hero. He had this laser clear focus on God, and he led the country with that focus, and he became very, very well thought of. But what I want you to know is his son, that wasn't the problem. It wasn't the problem that Jehoshaphat had passed him a bad legacy. That wasn't his issue. In fact, it wasn't his son's issue either, even though his Jehoshaphat's son's name was Jehoram, and the son behind him was Ahaziah. And so there are these 3 generations here, right? Grandson, son, and father. And they all kind of align differently. And what I want you to know is the grandson, he always aligned himself with bad people. People like King Ahab, people like Jezebel. And the grandson, he liked being in bad company. In fact, he even prided himself in being in bad company. But he couldn't blame that even on his dad, Jehoram, because his dad is the one in the story that I want to mention. Because there's a verse that sums up his life, and you won't forget this. Here's what it says. 2 Chronicles chapter 21, verse 20. If you want to write that verse down, or you can read it with me here. Here's what it says. Jehoram was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 8 years. He passed away, listen to what it says, to no one's regret, and was buried in the city of David, but not in the tombs of the kings. Now, let me just kind of break this down because there's a lot in these sentences here. But the first thing is this. It says he passed away to no one's regret. I mean, you think about that. What a horrible way to sum up a life, right? I mean, think about that. How would you like to be someone to say that? To no one's regret. I mean, you think to yourself, well, surely the wife missed him, right? Nope. Surely his kids missed him. Nope. Surely his friends, right, were sorry to see him go. Nope. No friends mention this. He passed away to no one's regret. Nobody could care less if he died. Truth be known, and this is only because we know a little bit of his story, they actually celebrated when he died. They were glad to see him go. They were glad to see that this lineage hopefully would end. In fact, he was buried in the city of David, but it says not in the king's tomb, not with the other kings. We're going to put him out farther. Even though he's going to be buried in the city of David, he's going to be out farther than where they are buried. He was never buried with his own people. Think about this. What does one have to do to die such an inglorious death? How does one have to live to be remembered in that way? He died to no one's regret. You know why? The reason why is pretty simple, because he lived to no one's benefit. That's why. He died to no one's regret because he lived for no one's benefit. Nobody benefited from his life. He apparently made no difference at all to anybody. He passed away to no one's regret. He died to no one's regret because he lived to no one's benefit. And so when he died, people were like, who cares? He squandered every leadership opportunity he ever had. And listen, he had every opportunity to do good, to make his life count, but he didn't. And here's the point. Your legacy, my legacy, will be determined by how we determine to give ourselves away. Our legacies will be determined by how we give ourselves away. So when I say, what will be said about you when you are gone? What will other people think? What will other people say? Your answer to that should be depending upon how you've given yourself away. And the truth of the matter is, we all have choices to make in life. And the reality of this sobering question is, did my life, did your life, did we live for ourselves, or did we live for other people? Did we serve? Let me ask you a question. And listen, my point this morning, I know because this is kind of a heavy message when we talk about legacy, right? My point this morning isn't to depress you, right? It's not to depress you about death. For those of you that have been thinking about this, it's not to, paint this negative picture of legacy in any kind of way. My point is, at some point in life, we have to stop just living life and start thinking about why we're living, what we're living for. I mean, have you thought about that lately in your life? What is all of this about? What am I doing here? What difference is my life going to make? I think at some point we have to stop just going forward with life and stop and think, because eventually, you all know this, again, this is another sobering reality, eventually we're going to run out of days. We're going to run out of time. We're eventually, if our lives are an hourglass, there's only so much grain of sand that will go through. So what's all this for? Here's another way of saying this, okay? And you can write down these questions because I think they're good introspective questions. Who is benefiting from my life right now? Who's standing on my shoulders? Who am I lifting up right now in my life? Who is able to see more clearly because I am helping them out in some kind of way? Who is it that you are investing in? Is your spouse being lifted up? Are your kids or grandkids being lifted up? Are the people around you being lifted up in the body of Christ, your brothers and sisters? what real difference are you making? This kind of questioning, I know it gets really personal. And it becomes even difficult for us to try to weigh and answer. I know it does for me. Many of you know a little bit about my story. I've never been shy of kind of sharing with you my upbringing and where I come from and different parts of my story and how I was raised. I wasn't raised in a Christian home. I wasn't raised around the church. And in fact, I very rarely, if ever went to church. There was only a couple times I can even remember in my life even going to church. And so much of my life was lived apart from Christ. And anytime I think about this idea of legacy, I can't help but think about how I was raised. And in particular, I'll just be flat out and tell you, I can't help but think about my father. And here's what I want to say. We've all been handed a legacy of some kind, right? You understand that? Whether it's been a good legacy or a bad legacy, whether there's, the people that handed that down to us have hurt us in some way in life. It may be your parents, maybe your grandparents. It may be a friend who kind of stood in because there was no one else there. But we've all been handed legacies. And I can't help, whenever I think about my legacy, I think about my dad. But it wasn't because it was a good example. It was because my dad was AWOL in my life for all of my life. My dad and my mom were married and divorced twice before I was a year and a half years old. And the reason being is because my father was an alcoholic all of my life. And he was kind of a womanizer early on in my mom and dad's marriage. And I barely had any relationship throughout my growing up with my dad. There's only a few weekends that I could ever remember spending with him. And every single example that I ever spent with my dad, I can never remember him not drinking or being drunk. Every example, I don't have one without it. Unfortunately, it was on my 14th birthday. I hadn't heard from my dad in quite a while. And so someone decided to go look for him. And when they did, they went into his house, they found him in his bathroom, and he was dead. And he died, the coroner said, from a massive stroke caused by the hardening of his arteries due to his excessive drinking problem. And my point in telling you that is not for you to look up here and say, man, I feel bad for Will. That's not it. I don't feel bad for myself. But I tell you that because regardless of where you come from or what legacy you've been handed down, we all have a challenge to make the most of the life that God has given us. And we can't look and we can't point and we can't blame anyone for it. You can either look back at your life, the bitterness of things, and you can remain bitter about it, or you can let God make things better. And that's what we've been saying throughout this series. And you have to fight for the legacy that God has in store for you. And we all need somebody in our life, don't we? We all need somebody that God's going to use to help us out. And to kind of picture this and to show you what I'm talking about, I want you to look in your Bibles to 2 Timothy chapter 2. And I only want to look at a couple of verses here. We're going to look at a few more verses before I close this morning. But in 2 Timothy chapter 2, I want to kind of use these first two verses to kind of communicate what it is that I mean by this. And this is Paul talking to Timothy, his young son in the faith. Listen to what he says. Timothy, my dear son, be strong through the grace that God gives you in Christ Jesus. You have heard me teach these things that have been confirmed by many reliable witnesses. Now teach these truths to other trustworthy people who will be able to pass them on to others. There's so much good in these verses, but let's just kind of break it down here. Paul is saying to Timothy, my dear son, and by the way, when Paul says my dear son, was Timothy actually a son? No. In fact, Paul was notoriously single, right? I mean, he was known as never being married, never having a relationship of any kind, whatsoever. And so Paul was a single man, and so he didn't have any children. But here he's talking about Timothy being his son. And so in other words, he has taken Timothy under his wing. He's not his biological son, but he is his son by choice. And so he's taken him under his wing. He's invited him to be a part of his life, to come around and to hang out and to listen and to live life with, to grow up. Paul wants to invest in him. He wants him to become somebody. And I don't think it would be possible if you were to talk to Paul this morning and ask him to describe his life. I don't think it would be possible for Paul to talk about his life and not talk about Timothy. Oh, I got to tell you about my son, Timothy. I mean, isn't that what parents do so often, right? We can't talk about our lives without talking about our children. And I don't think that would be the case of Paul. I don't think it'd be the case of Timothy either. I don't think you could ask Timothy about his life and he wouldn't want to talk to you about his father in the faith, Paul. And he'd have to tell you about how this guy invested in him and he passed on this baton of faith to him. And Paul told him, he's like, listen, it's your turn now to go and teach. Here's the baton. Run with it. Fight for your legacy, son. Fight for what God has done in your life. And this is my plea for our church. Is to think about what is this message about this morning? This is my plea. Don't waste your life. Don't waste your influence. Don't waste the moment where you could pass a baton on to someone else, because our lives eventually, you know this, they will come to an end. And what will matter is whether or not you've wasted your influence, you've wasted your time, whether or not you've wasted your life. And we have an opportunity, don't we? We have an opportunity to pass the baton on to those who come after us. And listen, you know this, it starts with your closest relationships. For many of us, it starts in our home. It starts with our spouses and our children, right? Our grandchildren. It starts with those that are closest to you. And you got to be able to open up your heart. And listen, it doesn't just end with family. It goes on to church family. And the reason I say that is because the very reason that I'm standing on the stage today isn't because anybody in my family shared their faith with me. You know why? It's because some people in the church decided to take me in as a son. They decided to teach me the gospel and decided to share with me Jesus. Decided to take me under their wing. A guy by the name of Ken, another man by the name of John, took me. And they instructed me in the ways of the truth. They instructed me in the ways of the Bible. And from there, I began a relationship with Jesus and I was baptized, all because they took me in. And I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't from them. And so much of my life, I felt like such an outsider to church. But let me just tell you, what they decided to do in my life was they told me, even before you believe, Will, you can belong here. In church, we have to do the same thing. We have to be able to tell people, you know what? You can come in and find belonging here even before you believe. You can belong. I felt like such an outsider for so long. But they welcomed me in. And I want you to think, church, think about the people that are around you, even right now. Think about your children, think about your grandchildren, think about the kids in our youth group. Think about the kids that come to our church who have no spiritual father or mother at all, no spiritual grandfather or grandmother at all. In fact, some of the people that live in our general areas, they don't have any physical family that live here. Jamie and I, we don't have any physical family that lives here. Think about how you can invest in the lives of the kids around you, the families around you. Think about the brokenness that you see. And so often, you know, what I've seen in so many of church families, all the brokenness, that broken homes, broken marriages, broken relationships. A lot of people look at that and they say, I don't want to get involved. It's too messy. It's going to take too much time. Listen, I know for a lot of kids in our church, it can go one of two ways. I know for a lot of kids that we have influence with in our lives, it can go one of two ways. One is you can invest in their life and they can turn out, literally, and I'm not trying to brag that I turned out to be this great person or anything, but I don't know what I would end up like if I didn't have people that adopted me in to be their son in the faith. It can go one of two ways, and in many cases, if we let those opportunities go by, it can go tragically wrong. And I can tell you this, how do you die to no one's regret? You simply live to no one's benefit. And when you're done, nobody cares that you're gone. Nobody misses because you made no contribution. And the tragic story that we can tell with our lives is that we've wasted our time, we've wasted our influence. Paul told Timothy, you know what, just be with me, just hang out with me. Just spend time with me. And that's really all it amounted to. And you think to yourself, well, what difference did that make? Well, it literally changed the world. Paul and Timothy was able to do so much for the kingdom of God. And it was just what God was able to do in that relationship. And I want you to hear that this morning, because God can do so much just through a simple relationship that you form. Somebody that God puts into your life, maybe even for a season or a period of time. But God puts them in your life for a reason. It can make such a huge difference. I want to tell you another story here as we close. And it's a story you may have heard of before. A guy by the name of Samuel Johnson. He was a British playwright. He was a lot of things, actually. He was a poet, writer. He was known for a lot of different areas that he was involved in, but it's not really his story I want to tell you about. I actually want to tell you about his biographer. His name was James Boswell. And Boswell was famous in his own right for a lot of different reasons. But he was the biographer of Samuel Johnson. And he tells a story of how his life was changed one day. And here's what he said. He said, I can remember crystal clear. He says, I know that one day that everything in my life changed. When they asked him what that day was, he said, it was the day that my dad and I went fishing. We went fishing together. And he says, we just talked. Don't remember catching any fish, which is how a lot of fishing stories go in my life. But we just talked. He says, it was so awesome. We just sat there, we just shared, and I was able to ask him questions, and he says, it was the greatest day of my life. Everything changed. And someone later, with the wherewithal to think about, because Boswell's father also kept a diary, kept a journal, and they thought, you know what, I'm going to look and see what he wrote about that day. And so they did. And here's what it said. They looked it up and said, went fishing today with my son. And then it just said, a day wasted. How do you die to no one's regret? You simply live to no one's benefit. And I mentioned to you earlier, these kings, right, that they grew up, and some of which had terrible legacies. Jehoshaphat, one who had a great legacy. You think to yourself, well, we've been talking about David in this series, right? King David and his life. What was his legacy? You know what I find interesting? Of all the places that you could look in the Bible to find David's legacy, probably the least place you would even think of would be the New Testament. And let alone in the New Testament to think about King David, where you would actually find a good representation of the legacy that he left, you'd find it in the book of Acts. But in Acts chapter 13, I want to just read to you a few verses here about what David's legacy was. And we mentioned this last week, that we know that through the lineage of King David came Jesus, right? And so the first few verses just simply says that. Listen to what it says in verse 32 of Acts chapter 13. It says, we tell you the good news. What God promised our fathers, he fulfilled for us, their children, by raising up Jesus. As it is written in the psalm, you are my son. Today I've become your father. The fact that God raised him from the dead, never to decay, is stated in these words, I will give you the holy and sure blessings promised to David. And so it is stated elsewhere, you will not let your Holy One see decay. Now all of this is talking about the lineage of David. Part of David's legacy is Jesus, which is absolutely amazing to think about. But then listen to what it says here in verse 36. For when David had served God's purpose in his own generation. He fell asleep. He was buried with his fathers, and his body decayed. I just want to stop right there. Did you catch that? One more time. When David had served God's purpose for his generation. Listen, your legacy will be remembered by two things. And these are the only two things I want to leave you with this morning. And I want to let God do whatever he wants to in your heart with them. But your legacy will be remembered by two things. Number one, it's by doing what God has created you to do. By doing what God has created you to do. And so the first question you ask yourself is, am I doing what God has created me to do? In whatever area of life you want to think about, whether it's with your family, whether it's at work, whether it's with your hobbies, whether it's with your free time, am I doing what God has created me to do? Because that's what David's legacy was, right? He had fulfilled the purpose that God had prepared for him in his generation. And here's the second thing. We've already mentioned it. How will you give yourself away? How will you give yourself away? How will you give of your time, your talents, your treasures? We're actually going to have a message in this series. We're going to talk about the fight of our life when it comes to the church, the fight for our church. We're going to talk about those three things, your time, your talents, your treasures. But I just want to end with it this morning. How are you giving yourself away? How are you fulfilling the purpose that God has created for you in Christ Jesus? He has created you on purpose and for purpose. And are you doing that? And secondly, how are you giving yourself away? Because David certainly did that. He gave himself away. And his lineage, his legacy is that of Jesus, who became the ultimate sacrifice for all humanity, who gave literally everything he had away. And so as we come into this time of invitation, the things I want you to be thinking about this morning is, what are you living for? What is it in your life right now that you are living for? And what will people say after you're gone? Let's pray together. God,